In this video, we're going to see how we can export a Substance Designer material and use it in other apps. We already brushed over this in the previous videos. We mentioned SBS files and sbsar files, but we also have the outputs here. So how does that all work exactly? There are two ways you can approach it. The first one is to simply export the outputs and load them as regular textures in whatever app you're working in. This method is quick and easy, but it's also a bit limited as you will not be able to iterate on the textures directly. The second way is to publish your material as a Substance archive and then to load it using the Substance integration that you will find in most DCCs and game engines. This method is a bit heavier and requires more work, but it allows you to interact with the material directly. We're going to cover both techniques in this video, and we will also see how we can send our work to other Substance apps such as Substance Painter and Stager. So let's get started. And we can begin with the most straightforward option, which is to export the outputs directly. Now, you remember that one of the first things we did when we set up our project was to create these outputs that are sitting at the very end of our graph. And each output corresponds to a map. So we have the translucency map here, the ambient occlusion map, the height map, and so on. If we want to save these, we can do it from the 2D view directly by simply clicking on the save icon. But this is obviously not the smartest way to handle this, as you would have to repeat this step for each output. So if you want to export your outputs all at once, you need to come over to the toolbar and click on that wrench here. Then go to Export Outputs. It will prompt you with this export window, and there's a few interesting things going on here, so let's break it down together. First, there's of course the location where you want to save your outputs to. I'm going to create a folder for that. Ornate Fabric. All right. Then you have the format. Depending on the quality you're looking for, you can change that. I'm going to stick with PNG. Then below that, you have your outputs listed. And so you can decide to uncheck some of these in case you don't want to export them all. You can change the color space as well, but the default is usually fine, so I wouldn't touch that. And when you're happy with your settings, you can simply click on Export Outputs. Now, notice that right above it, we have this automatic export option. This is extremely useful because it will allow you to create a live link between your graph and whatever third-party software you're going to render in. So I'm going to check that box too and click on Export. And now, if I navigate to the folder I created, I have all my maps properly exported and ready to be used. All right, let's now go over a couple of scenes that I have opened here. First, I have this Blender project, very simple, just a cloth mesh and a basic lockout around it. Now, to import my designer outputs here, it's very simple. I'm going to click on the mesh, create a material, click on the main BSDF here, and to make things quicker, I have the node wrangler activated, and so if I press Ctrl, Shift, and T with my BSDF selected, it will open up my file explorer. I can then navigate to my outputs folder, and here I'm going to select everything except two maps. The ambient occlusion, I'm not going to use that one because Blender doesn't really read it by default, so we can skip this. And the translucency map. This one we could use, but it needs its own shader, so you would have to import it separately and use a mixed shader node for that. All right, so with all my maps selected, I can just click on Principal Texture Setup, and the Node Wrangler will automatically connect each map to the matching input here. And that's it. You don't need to do anything else, really. Now, the cool thing about this setup is that, say I go back to my graph and change my mind about something. For example, I want to go for a different preset. Then if I go back to Blender and refresh the textures, it all updates accordingly. So this is how you create a live link between your designer graph and your material in another app. Of course, the same logic applies everywhere. So here, for instance, I have an Unreal project open. I have all my maps here in the content browser. And here again, I can just iterate on my graph, then re-import the maps in Unreal like so. And there you go, everything updates. Very simple. Now, what if I don't want a simple live link, but the actual Substance archive with all its parameters directly in the app I'm using? Well, for that, I would need two things. First, I need to publish my material as an sbsar, which we haven't done yet. And second, I need to use the Substance integration to load it in my final software. So let's first go over the sbsar publishing process. The hardest is behind us now with all the exposing process done. So all we need to do now is to publish it as an archive. Now, a few caveats here. So remember, we have two graphs in our package, and we're now in our main graph, right? And if I take a look at its attribute, which is a tab we haven't really covered, we have quite a few important things like the name of the graph. Then we have the type, which is set to unspecified by default. It's not a huge deal, you could leave it this way, but it's best to sort it in the right group, especially if you're going to use it in another Substance app like Painter. So let's go for standard material. Then you have the physical size sliders. Now this is interesting, we haven't really touched upon this, but if you want your material to stay at scale with your model, this is the way you do it. You would obviously need to keep this information in mind from the start, like saying, okay, so 800 threads in the warp equals, I don't know, 100 centimeters, and so on and so forth. The z-axis in this case corresponds to the depth of the displacement. So we're not going to bother with that, but this is the kind of metadata that can be useful in certain workflows. Okay, so let's scroll down a little to this bit here, this exposed in sbsar button. It's set to yes, which is perfect. But if we click on our subgraph now, you see that it's also set to yes. And we don't really want that because this graph is just an internal utility and not something that we want to interact with. So let's set it to no. All right, we're good to go now, ready to publish this whole thing as a Substance archive. To do so, just click on the package. So if the option is grayed out, it's because you clicked on the graph. So on the package, then on that little arrow icon here, and publish as sbsar or Control P. We're going to leave everything at default and simply choose a location. All right, done. Now, if you change something in your project and you want it to be updated in your sbsar, you would have to do it manually because it doesn't auto-update like the outputs export. So just click on that circling arrow here or Control-Shift-P. All right, so I have my sbsar file here. Now what? Can I just drag and drop it in Blender or Unreal? The answer is yes, but to be able to use an sbsar outside of Substance, you will need to rely on the integration that Substance has. So this integration is usually like small plugins that you can install for free. In Blender, for instance, it comes as an add-on that you can just download and install. I'm not going to show you the process for that here, but we have a dedicated video that you can check out. So with the add-on activated, you see that I now have this Substance tab on the side in my shader editor, and I can load my sbsar directly here. All right, and you see that below that, I now have all my parameters at hand. So let me just click on Apply, and then I can interact with the parameters directly here in Blender. So this is really powerful. Just a quick warning, in case you tried it and it doesn't work, make sure you use the latest version of these plugins, as our material uses nodes that rely on designer's latest engine. So if you have an error message or your material simply doesn't load, it's very likely that your integration is not up to date. As I'm recording this, I'm in Blender 4.0 and the Substance add-on is 2.0. Same goes with Unreal, where we have this plugin that you can find in the marketplace, so Substance 3D for Unreal Engine. Once it's installed and activated, you will be able to drag and drop any sbsar in your content browser and play with the parameters directly in Unreal. Other softwares like Clo or Marvelous Designer have the integration already installed for you, so you can just load your material there and start customizing it on the spot. So this is how you export and reuse your sbsar. There is one more scenario that I like to cover, and that's using your sbsar within the Substance ecosystem. So typically sending it to Painter or Stager. If we come over to the Publish button, you'll notice that we have these Send To options here. And if I were to click on any of these, it would just open up the app for me with my material already imported and ready to be used. It's really convenient, I use it all the time. So for instance, I have this Painter project, and if I do a Send to Painter, there we go. My material automatically pops up in the shelf, and I can start using it right away. And of course, all my parameters are available here as well. So if I want to, for example, get rid of the trim, I can do it in one click. Another thing that can be very interesting is that with this kind of setup, you can take advantage of your layers to customize your material. For instance, let me show you. I'm going to add a pattern real quick below my fabric layer. I'm going to do this in a mask. Grab something nice in the textures. All right, and now if I add an anchor point here, it will let me reuse that information as a custom input anywhere above this layer. So if I switch the ornaments type here to custom, I can then scroll down and load this anchor point and use it to drive my ornament with. I can even paint in there if I want to. Like so. Look at that, how cool is that? That's a really powerful combination between proceduralism and a more manual approach. So you now know how to export your work both in the Substance ecosystem and out of it. And this concludes our journey through Substance Designer. I hope you feel both inspired and empowered to experiment with your own ideas now. Substance Designer is a fascinating software that offers endless possibilities, and most importantly, it is very forgiving. You don't have to know everything about it to get started. So give it a try, play, experiment, and stay creative. Also, don't forget to share your first works with the community. We would love to see what you create.